I've drafted this with a lot of help from friends and activists and lawyers in India. Some of them are in the room, some are not. But I take all the blame for what is wrong, and I have no doubt in my mind that there is much that needs to be clarified. Maybe the whole thing needs to be dropped in, and we need to start afresh. But we'll see how that turns out. So just a brief historical overview before I draw attention to the broad features of the bill. I think India's problem was that it was an early bird in anti-discrimination field. It started much earlier than most other jurisdictions. Alongside the US, to the best of my knowledge, I think only India and the United States were thinking about discrimination as a concern as early as in the late 19th century in a systematic way. US was grappling with race and India was grappling with caste, and maybe because of the egregious nature of these particular forms of discrimination, we started early. Early intervention in India took the form of affirmative action measures in a number of primarily princely states in the late 19th century, which, as we all know, became entrenched in the Constitution in 1950. Now, of course, the two, affirmative action and anti-discrimination, are mutually reinforcing norms, as we'll see shortly in the bill, but perhaps due to the early movers' complacence, anti-discrimination part of that equation, both constitutional and statutory, remained seriously underdeveloped in India. It did find some articulation in the Civil Rights Act of 1955 and in the Scheduled Caste and Scheduled Tribe Prevention of Atrocities Act. There's also a provision in the Equal Pay Act on sex discrimination, but these have largely remained underdeveloped, under-enforced. And I have some views about why that is the case, partly because of their criminal nature, which has a higher burden of proof, which faced with a skeptical judiciary, a skeptical prosecution, and a skeptical police, becomes even more difficult to make headway with. But anyway, this underdevelopment also remained largely untouched by the dramatic movements on the issue in the latter part of the 20th century, in the US, in the United Kingdom, in Canada, in Australia, in the European Union, and most recently in South Africa. So because India started early, it did not feel the need to look at what's happening elsewhere. And I think that's been a mistake. Of course, comparative law has to be done with great caution and care, and we have to think about what will work here, what our problems are. But I think looking at how others have dealt with similar problems is a source for inspiration. So in my book, well, I have left Australia out, and I do plead guilty to that, but I have looked at comparative developments elsewhere, particularly in South Africa, Canada, the US, and the UK, and I've drawn upon those experiences as well as my conversations and my own understanding of the situation in India to draft this bill. Before I say any more about the bill itself, there's one message I have for any comparativists in the room today. If you're interested in this area, please do not look at the current practice in the United States for inspiration. And if you do, look at it only to figure out how things could go dramatically wrong and what to be wary of. That great jurisdiction invented and exported many of the concepts that have become a mainstay in this area around the world, and then faced severe backlash, and is currently being significantly rolled back. So if there's a moral in the story, it's that jurisdictions can move forward and also move backward, and the US has become an outlier in discrimination law among all these jurisdictions, and we should be wary about, or bear in mind, that particular reactionary history in the United States. I won't highlight all the Indian precedents. Have already touched upon the affirmative action provisions, the constitutional provisions, and some of the other post-independence statutory provisions. Suffice it to say that existing laws remain patchy, poorly designed. They don't protect all groups that need protection, and they rarely extend to the private sector, and when they do, they tend to be criminal rather than civil in nature, and therefore partly poorly enforced. That India needs a comprehensive, multi-sectoral, multi-ground, and civil anti-discrimination law that covers the public and the private sector has been articulated and accepted for over a decade now. I think the Bhopal Declaration on Caste, which Dr. Shyam Babu was a part of, recognized this in 2002. The Sachar Commission report on the status of Muslims in India said as much in 2006. The women's movement and the movement for rights of persons with disabilities have long asked for it, with some degree of success for the latter. The Delhi High Court unsuccessfully tried to extend the constitutional protections to sexual minorities in 2008. The Supreme Court, with a bit more success in relation to Hijras in the Nalsa judgment. So the affirmation of anti-discrimination principle is what, or at least the demand that it be affirmed, is what binds all of these recent struggles and developments and movements. What is needed is a mutual conversation to recognize what's common in all these different strands, and that it needs a common and principled response, one that recognizes the fellowship of the disadvantaged, rather than one that encourages a politics of competitive disadvantage. So all these groups, I believe, can come together to see how they can together deal with very similar problems and also learn from each other's experiences. So now to the bill. Now, designing complex legislation is a process, and today's consultation is another step in that direction. I hope that the Delhi government will move on the issue, have its own consultations, and improve upon the draft or come up with a better one. And indeed, governments in other states in India, and hopefully someday the central government too, will recognize the need for this legislation and join this conversation. So very broadly, the bill seeks to create, I hope everyone has a copy of the bill. If you don't, there are copies outside which you can pick up, because we'll be talking through some of the provisions throughout the course of the day. So very broadly, the bill creates civil liability for acts of discrimination. There are some provisions for protection orders modeled on the Domestic Violence Act, for ongoing or anticipated aggravated forms of discrimination. If you're going to pick up the bill, I'll hold on for a moment. There was a prior consultation in Bangalore in December last year, it was in December or January last year, where we spoke to some activists from the ground and figured out what's really good. And I've been speaking to many activists since. So you'll see a lot of provisions in the bill that don't feature in Indian legislation hitherto, but not even in comparative in Canadian or South African legislation. So things that deal with issues like boycott, calls for boycott, or segregation, so all of those are attempts to articulate the lived reality of discrimination in the peculiar Indian system. Some of the provisions have been inspired by what's happened in India before, what's happened elsewhere before, but we'll hopefully have the time to discuss all of that in the panels, and what's been missed out will be very useful to know. So we'll have panels on different aspects of the bill through the day today, and we'll look at a selection of provisions related to a theme, and then from the floor we will have comments and questions.
If you want to respond to it later, then
Oh, absolutely. This is meant to be the beginning of a civil society conversation. Yeah. So I want to structure my brief introduction to the bill around 4 broad themes, and if I can get to the presentation. The first is the protectorate. It's a language borrowed from Owen Fiss, who was one of the first people who wrote on this issue, which is, who does the bill seek to protect? The second is, what sort of duties does the bill impose? The third is who bears these duties? So who are the duty bearers? And finally, what the enforcement and remedies provisions are. To start with, who does the bill seek to protect from discrimination? There are a few concepts here which we need to look at. Section 3 of the bill defines protected characteristics. This should be a familiar notion. Article 15 of the Constitution uses it, where where certain grounds or personal characteristics are deemed to be protected. So, legislation, policy, and life generally requires line drawing. We often assume that certain types of lines are not acceptable to be drawn, and these include caste, race, ethnicity, sex, gender, identity, pregnancy. You'll see the full list in Section 3. Section 4 of the bill then identifies protected groups. These are groups that are defined by these identities or characteristics, or a combination of these groups of these characteristics. So on sex, men and women are both protected groups, but you can also have intersectional groups, like Dalit women, for example, are defined by the combination of caste and gender, and they may have particular concerns that may not be covered either by women as a group or Dalits as a group. So that's included in protected groups. What's also included are people who are perceived, rightly or wrongly, to be members of certain groups and therefore face discrimination, and people who are associated with members of those groups. So a carer for a person who cares for her disabled son, even if not herself disabled, should be protected on the grounds of disability because of her caring obligations. The third provision I want to draw your attention to under the protectorate is Section 20, which defines disadvantaged groups. Now, the difference between protected groups and disadvantaged groups is this. Protected groups are all groups with a few exceptions for disability in pregnancy. All groups defined by a characteristic, whether the group is advantaged or disadvantaged. So men are also protected groups, so are Brahmins, so are Hindus. So all the dominant groups are also protected in that the anti-discrimination norm applies symmetrically. It protects men as well as women. It protects Brahmins as well as Dalits from discrimination, and we can go into the reasons, both political and principled, as to why that is necessary. Section 20 defines disadvantaged groups who are only the disadvantaged part of that equation, and these groups are the only groups that can benefit from positive measures, affirmative action, diversification, etc. But we'll come to that distinction later, and I think one of our panelists, Jenna, wants to focus on that as well. So at the moment, I'm just giving a broad overview of the entire bill. Next, let's move to duties. So the bill broadly enforces two distinct types of duties. They're negative duties, which is the duty not to discriminate, and there are a host of positive duties. The negative duties are enforced by Section 12, but are defined by sections leading up to Section 12. And they can broadly be classified into two broad heads. One is, I use the word mere with some self-consciousness. I call it mere discrimination only to distinguish it from what the bill calls aggravated forms of discrimination, but we know that mere discrimination is also not mere discrimination, as it were. But this non-aggravated discrimination is not the language that the bill uses. The bill only has a category of discrimination, and then a subset of that is aggravated discrimination. So I'll take you through each form, and I'll tell you why I've made that distinction in a moment. Section 5 defines direct discrimination, which is direct in the sense that either it's directly intended to harm, injure, or humiliate or affect members of a protected group, or is motivated by prejudice, or directly relies on a protected characteristic. There's a long list of things that directly impact or directly use one of the protected characteristics, and there are a list of examples which we should be able to look at in the second panel, focusing on duties. This is on page 8 of the bill. Indirect discrimination is defined in Section 6, which is basically prima facie neutral provisions which nonetheless have an impact on a particular group more than others. So for example, an employer who pays part-time workers at a lower hourly rate than full-time workers, in a context where most part-time workers are women and most full-time workers are men, would be discriminating indirectly on the grounds of sex. Or, for example, a housing society which requires a master's degree for all tenants in a context where a certain group tends not to have master's level education, say based on caste, would again be indirectly discriminating. Now, these are prima facie direct and indirect discriminations. There's a justification clause in each bill, in each provision, where the onus is on the defendant after the prima facie case has been made to show why it's acceptable. And the justification is much harder if the discrimination is direct, relatively easier if it's indirect. And again, in the second panel, we might have the chance to go through it. And again, that opens up the possibility, which Michael warned against, of judges using justification to blow a huge hole in the legislation. You have to be wary of that possibility. We have to think about whether there are ways in drafting and designing the bill that can overcome that. But all of that is up for discussion. Section 7 defines harassment, which is communication or conduct related to a protected characteristic that has the purpose or effect of creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading or bullying or humiliating environment for the person. Victimization under Section 11 seeks to protect people who want to bring action under the bill. So anybody who wants to bring, it's like whistleblower protection. If you want to pursue a matter under the bill, you should not be further victimized for wanting to do that or doing that. So that's Section 11. Then let's move to the aggravated forms of discrimination, which I've defined in Sections 8, 9 and 10. Section 8 deals with calls for a boycott of a particular group, and the boycott could be social, economic, political, cultural, and it can take any form of avoidance, ostracism, excommunication or exclusion of a group. It's a very particularly Indian experience, and this is not found in other jurisdictions, but I thought it's important to address the way that discrimination manifests itself socially in certain contexts in India. Section 9 defines segregation, where because of your group membership, either because you belong to the same group or because same Gotra, for example, or different groups, different religions, you are stopped from marrying each other, from interacting with each other, from contracting with each other, from being friends with each other, etc. So that's segregation, which is also prohibited. And finally, discriminatory violence. When you use illegal violence but targeted at a protected group, that's also prohibited. And again, I've included a public servant's duty if they have the ability to protect and fail to do so, or cause others to fail to do so. That will count as discriminatory violence itself. So these are broadly the anti-discrimination duty provisions. There are a few exceptions mentioned in Section 12, and I've called it exception for simplicity. Well, it's not called exceptions in the bill, but basically these, just for avoidance of doubts, affirmative action, diversification, diversity training, etc. will not count as discrimination. There are also specific exemptions in the schedule at the back of the bill. There are moments when, for example, there may be good reasons to insist on same-sex close quarter housing, for example, right? That's exempted. And there's similar other examples. So we might want to think about what's missing from the schedule or what should be added, but we can come to that in a moment. The positive duties, so these are all the negative duties that the bill prohibits. The positive duties are mentioned in Section 16, which is the diversification duty. Now, I'll say in a moment, actually it might be useful to mention it first. Not all duties apply to everyone. The anti-discrimination duty applies only to employers in relation to employees, to landlords in relation to tenants, to traders in relation to consumers, to service providers in relation to consumers, to public authorities, all state bodies in relation to citizens and non-citizens, and to private contractors working for the state in relation to anyone affected by the function. Aggravated discrimination, this is where the aggravated, non-aggravated distinction comes into force. If it's aggravated discrimination, that is boycott, segregation or discriminatory violence, the duty not to issue calls for boycott, not to segregate, not to indulge in discriminatory violence applies to everyone. So even when you're not wearing these hats, a a private person who calls for the boycott of Muslims will also be caught by this bill. And all the positive duties, or most of the positive duties, only apply to state bodies, well, defined broadly as public authorities. So diversification, diversity training, and due regard duty. And I'll just say what they are. So section 16 talks about diversification. If there is a disadvantaged group that we looked at under section 20, if that's substantially excluded from a particular public service, then that service has a duty to diversify. So if, for example, they're very in proportion to their population, if Dalits, excuse me, I'll just give Jenna a call back so she's online. If Dalits are particularly excluded in relation to their population from the police force, the police force has a duty to increase their participation in the force. The diversity training duty is again a duty to train judges, public officials, and other people who enforce this act into the purposes of what is the point of this legislation, mainly to engage with what Michael warned against, which is that having good law is not enough. You also need the right people to do the job. I won't say very much about the other duties because I'm sure that will come up in our discussion. Sorry, just one more moment. I think I've just become online again, so I'll call Jenna once more. Hopefully get her this time. Okay. I've already told you about the duty bearers, and finally the enforcement provisions. This is quite complicated. We'll deal with enforcement in the third panel this afternoon, where there's provision to designate certain courts as certain district courts as equality courts, which have the duty to enforce the anti-discrimination duty, except where the duty is breached by a law in force. If it's breached by a legislation, then that enforcement goes to the High Court, not to the District Court. This is in keeping with our constitutional culture, where laws can be challenged only before High Courts and Supreme Court. Aggravated discrimination, and this is the point of making the distinction.
Explain that again. You say discrimination is by a law.
So, for example, Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code is a discriminatory piece of legislation that can be called into question only before the High Court, not under the equality courts, because it's legislation. You may have another law, for example, that has, so for example, the provision for Hindu undivided family and the tax law, which has a discriminatory impact on all non-Hindus in tax affairs. That is a matter that should be considered by the High Court, not by district courts. Does that make sense?
No.
Aggravated discrimination, you can go to the equality court for civil remedies, but if it's ongoing or anticipated, there's a provision in sections 30 and 31 to go to the magistrate to get protection orders. These are restraint orders modeled after the Domestic Violence Act to basically say, look, stop it. Right? So it's quasi-criminal in nature, in the sense that the magistrate only tells the person who's given the call for segregation or boycott, or who's engaged in violence, to stop doing it, and it's backed by the authority of the criminal code. The diversification duty and diversity training, these are matters to be dealt with by the Equality Commission, because these are largely bureaucratic measures that have to be dealt with within the administrative framework. And the due regard duty, which is borrowed from the UK, and we'll talk about whether it makes sense in the Indian context. I've currently put it with the High Court, but we can think about it. So that's a whistle-stop tour. There's a lot on remedies as well, which I haven't talked about in section 12, etc. The remedies including damages, restraint orders, apologies, etc. But I'm sure we'll come to all of that in the panels. So that's all from me for now. I think we can go into the first panel.